It's Monday, May 8th, 2017, and this is the year this is the podcast 3000 NFL mock draft in the year 2017. We're a week and some change outside of the 2017 NFL draft. The Seahawks selected a bunch of players. They signed some players afterwards. Me and Rob, we talked about, that stuff moments seemingly after it all went down and happened. And now we've had extra time to sort of reflect on the Seahawks, new rookies and how they'll fit into the defense and the offense and, with the established veterans. So it's the time to once again do it again and take another look at the players that the Seahawks drafted this year. So that's what this is. And it's a new year. So that means a new try at, trying to talk good and have better intros. 0 for 1. So let's get into it. The Seahawks drafted 11 players. One of them came with pick 35 after they traded down twice, and that guy's name was Malik McDowell and continues to be Malik McDowell unless something's happened that I'm not aware of. So it was that name, and it still is. Defensive tackle, pass rushing from the inside. Maybe he lacks the desire to play at a high level, but that's something that's still to be found yet seen. So kicking it over to Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Rob, you've had more time now to look at Malik, though you did look at him before the draft because, he was one of the most high-profile players in college football going into last season and, afterwards, and people knew that he could be a first-round pick. So he's the one probably you did the most research on before the draft, and now he's the Seahawks top pick, and you've had 8 days or 10 days since then to look at him. What are your thoughts today about Malik McDowell, how he fits into the Seahawks defense, and how disruptive he could be maybe as a rookie?
Well, I just think it was a really interesting pick with hindsight now, to kind of go back and look at, what they did in the draft. And I think first and foremost, there was a lot of reaction to why they didn't draft Kevin King or why they didn't go offensive line first. And I think to start talking about Malik McDowell, you kind of have to understand why they picked him instead of a Cam Robinson, instead of Kevin King when they were at 31. And I think it does make a lot of sense. When you look at the players that were available at 58 and you look at the players that were available at 90, this was the best way for the Seahawks to best fill their top three needs, which were cornerback, which was defensive line, and which was offensive line. So, there was no chance of getting an interior pass rusher of McDowell's kind of talent at 58 or at 90. There was a chance to get a good cornerback at 90. There was a chance to get Ethan Pocic, who they clearly liked, at 58. And they obviously didn't feel that they could get that option at 90. Apologies if you're a baby crying in the background, by the way. But, I've gone back and I've had a look at McDowell and I've tried to sort of, piece together what he is as a player. And in trying to do that, I wanted to go back to 2013 when perhaps the Seahawks defense was at its best, when the defense was the most productive, when it had players who were really disruptive up front. And we saw Clinton McDonald that year had 6.5 sacks. And I went back and watched the Houston game today and had a look at sort of the Seahawks defense maybe when it was at its best. And he was such a disruptive force in that game. There was a couple of big plays in that 2013 Houston game where he sort of collapsed the pocket. It made life a lot easier for people like Chris Clemons and some of the other pass rushers. And, all of that combined made for a much more balanced defensive line. I think something that we've seen over the last couple of years is that there just hasn't been that interior presence whatsoever. They've had good stout run stoppers. They've been very good in terms of run defense overall, but they haven't had players that can really push the pocket, move quarterbacks off the spot. And I think that the likes of Bennett and Clark and Averill are really going to benefit from this Malik McDowell pick. He is somebody who is a bit out of control at times, that isn't going to be particularly good in gap discipline and gap control, which might limit his ability to play early downs inside. I think we'll probably see him at base end and then moving inside on sort of the third downs or the obvious passing situations, because he isn't quite that control player that Jaron Reed is, that can hold the point of attack, that Thomas Rubin's probably going to play quite early, because against the run, and that's what the Seahawks want to do. They want to limit the run early and then be opportunistic, pressure in third and long, let the secondary play. that is kind of what they want to do. So I think in those sort of money down situations, that is where McDowell is going to have his impact. And the one thing he consistently does well, Kenny, is get into the backfield. And if you have got somebody, even if it's a bit out of control at times, even if it is, not necessarily having a plan, it's just a case of brute strength, a one-arm bull rush or, a swim rip and getting into the backfield. If you just have somebody who if the quarterback can feel the presence of somebody in that backfield, it can impact games. And I think the McDowell pick, I've seen a lot of things, people saying it's this huge boom or bust type of thing, and he's either going to be a Pro Bowler or he's going to be out of the league in 2 or 3 years. And I don't quite see it that way. I think there is more of a grey middle area that he can get to, and that is somebody who maybe doesn't have 10 sacks a season or 8 sacks a season, maybe someone who never becomes Calais Campbell, but just somebody who is capable on his day of making a few plays which can really help the defense. And I think it's a bit overblown. I mean, we talked a lot about his character, his personality, and his body language is poor. There's no getting away from that, and that's why I didn't think the Seahawks were going to entertain drafting him unless they traded down, which they did. But that being a bit of a introvert and not being the most engaging personality in interviews is one thing. Being a bad character guy is another. And there is no evidence whatsoever of this guy being a problem in terms of character. He's not Percy Harvin. He hasn't been arrested. He hasn't been, kicked off the field or anything like that. He's just a guy who had a questionable effort last year when he was carrying an injury, when the team was at Michigan State was completely collapsing around him. So, and one other thing to consider here, and this is something that I should have considered more before the draft. They were asking him to play an awful lot of nose tackle at 6'6", 295. He is not a nose tackle. You will not find a nose tackle in the country who is 6'6" and 295. And they were asking him to play that role an awful lot, absorbing double teams, trying to hold the middle together because he was the only one who could do it. And that must have got to him a little bit. I mean, if you're wondering why his effort waned, if you're wondering why he didn't play hard towards the end of the year, the injury is one thing. I think the role that he was asked to do as a nose tackle is another one. I mean, it did not suit him, and it's pretty understandable why that could have affected his game. But I think the Seahawks have got a player that will disrupt the middle on those sort of key downs, and it should help the other defensive linemen on the roster.
And on Seahawks Draft Blog, you mentioned sort of you compared the selections of Malik McDowell and Nazir Jones to the needs or that people were talking about for a cornerback and where that 26 to 35 range, what players they had in that 26 to 5 range as cornerbacks or defensive tackles. And obviously, there's no point in really thinking about what if the Seahawks had drafted this guy or that guy, but just in terms of the players that they lost out on or, passed on from 26 to 35 to Karis McKinley, Tre'Davious White, Taco Charlton, David Njoku, TJ Watt, Reuben Foster, Ryan Ramczyk, Kevin King, and Cam Robinson. I mean, that's 10 players that we talked about with the Seahawks or people talked about with the Seahawks in general. A bunch, all of them, players that were well liked and others that were not that well liked, maybe like Cam Robinson or something like that, where it was just a variance of opinions or whatever. But in terms of your opinion, Rob, those 10 players, from Takk McKinley to TJ Watt and Reuben Foster and Kevin King, any of them that right now you think that a couple years from now you'll be thinking, I think it's too bad that they didn't take Takk McKinley, or it's too bad that they didn't take this guy, someone that you would like more than Malik McDowell?
Well, look, people can play that game if they want to. If people want to look back on the draft and sort of say, with hindsight, they should have done this, that, and the other, then, they will do that. It will happen. Some fans will want to do that. I think the best thing to do is to sort of understand why they did what they did. And, you could break it down, and they could have had Malik McDowell, and they could have had Ethan Pocic, and they could have Shaquille Griffin, 3 guys that they probably believe can become legitimate impact starters for them down the line. Or they could have taken Kevin King in the first round, and then it could have been someone like Montravius Adams, or maybe just, Nazir Jones, who they took anyway. And it could be someone like Cordrea Tankersley. I mean, what is more likely to provide you with 3 really great players? I would argue with the first scenario. With McDowell, you are taking a little bit of a chance on a guy who fell, but has got the potential to be really, really good at a position that they have admitted they needed for such a long time, which is that interior pass rusher. And if they can get that, I mean, what holds back this defense? I mean, like, we can talk about, needing to get younger at the secondary, which they did anyway. What holds back the defense more than anything? It is that interior pass rush. It's not having that sort of dynamic interior guy, because they've got edge rushers, they've got great linebackers, they've got really good secondary players. It's just that interior position. So the fact that they prioritized that, nobody should have an issue with that. In fact, I went back and had a look at what people were saying in January, right after the Falcons game, because I definitely got influenced a little bit by all of the hype around the cornerback class and the defensive back class, and started focusing so much on that. But what were people actually saying that they wanted in January after that game? They were talking about go and restock the secondary, get some youth in the secondary. They were talking about improving the offensive line, and they were talking about going and signing Calais Campbell as a free agent. That is what a lot of the fans on my blog, at least, or on Twitter, were talking about. There was an awful lot of clamor for Calais Campbell, and then sort of using the draft to get cornerbacks and safeties and offensive line. Okay, there was no chance of getting Calais Campbell. He signed like a $15 million a year deal in Jacksonville. There was no chance of that. So what do? They go and draft a guy who they even compared to Campbell in the press conference immediately after the third round. They actively compared this guy to Calais Campbell. I mean, I don't know. I quite like watching Calais Campbell. If other fans feel the same way, then wouldn't you like to take a chance on somebody who's been compared to Calais Campbell by Pete Carroll, who knows a thing or two about defense? And the other two things they've done is they've got the offensive lineman that a lot of people have been asking for. Not someone who is incredibly explosive, not someone who's this great athlete, not a George Fant type, or a Jermaine Ifedi or a Christian Sokoli type of lineman. They've took a guy that is technically good, that is, very much a zone blocking guy, the kind of player that theoretically, whether it's this year or next year, they can plug in and is going to do a solid job for you. A kind of guy that maybe you don't notice for doing a bad job, but will not necessarily be Zach Martin at the next level, but just does a really solid job. That kind of the role that Max Unger did for the Seahawks for such a long time. And then the third and fourth round has been about retooling the secondary with playmakers, with Shaquille Griffin, who was number 4 for passes defended in 2016. Tedric Thompson, number 1 for passes defended. A cornerback and a safety that you can really go with there. Delano Hill, who we'll come on to in a minute, is a very, very versatile safety. He doesn't sort of take after Earl or Cam, but might be able to be a bit of a combination of the two there. And then a receiver as well, which is another position that a lot of people have been asking for some competition, because people are down on Jermaine Kearse, and the Lockett injury is there, and Richardson's been banged up as well. So as if you were to sort of say to Seahawks fans in January, you're going to get 4 third-round picks, you're going to have 2 second-round picks, and the 4th rounder, and this is what you're going to spend your picks on, I think most of them would say, yes, that is a good plan.
After the Malik McDowell pick, at 35, a lot more guys coming off the board that the Seahawks, didn't take, for one reason or another. Budda Baker, Zay Jones, Forrest Lamp, Marcus May, Curtis Samuel, Dalvin Cook, Marcus Williams, Sidney Jones. I mean, it's such an interesting list of players. I feel like it's not just because we talked these players to death on 3,000 NFL mock draft for a year, because even more so than other years, I feel like I'm looking at a long list of players that seemed really good. And so it still seems to be a class that will have a lot of talent deep into the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds, maybe 6th and 7th. We're going to get a couple good guys in there. Just seems that way. Maybe definitely in the middle rounds where, when John Schneider talked about there being pockets in this draft and places where it would be bunched up and get really good players, seems like the 2nd round was a place for that. With Obi Melifonwu even only going 2 picks before the Seahawks pick at 58, being Ethan Pocic, the offensive lineman. Rob, with Ethan Pocic, what are the odds? What are the odds of him being able to play tackle? What are the odds? Because there's a lot of different ways that it could go with it, which is, there's the thought that maybe he could play tackle. And then, there's also the thought that did they just draft a center to replace Justin Britt? Or, is this going to be a guy that's going to be a solid guard for a long time? And obviously Ethan Posic's future remains undetermined, and even the people running the show don't know what Ethan Pocic is going to be next year, or definitely not in 4 years. But after watching Ethan Pocic for a while and doing some more study on him, what do you think he ends up as a rookie and maybe his long-term future?
Well, I don't personally look at him and see, a long-term tackle prospect. There are maybe some reasons why some people might believe that, and his mobility is very good. One of the things that LSU did an awful lot was have the center pull around, and you don't see it that often in college football, but he was doing it an awful lot, and he did a very good job of moving from center, getting to the second level, locking onto a target, and blocking at the second level. So, with that kind of mobility and agility, then, I can see why some people would think maybe he can play tackle. But I think for me, he's best inside, center and guard, and I think that's where they said they're going to try him initially. Are his two best positions. His hand technique is a huge bonus. I mean, he's when he locks on to a block, it's pretty much over. I mean, he will connect. You don't see defensive linemen disengaging when he locks onto them. He's kind of like, I described it on the blog as like a subtle but successful blocker, in that he's not about power. He's not going to demolish people and pancake people at the line of scrimmage, but he'll get his hands on them. His hand placement's really good. He gets leverage. Even though he's really tall, he will get the leverage and he will lock on. Now, there are some occasions, I mean, I've seen these clips emerge on Twitter, because it's very easy these days to sort of take a 10-second clip, show either a really great player or a really bad player, and sort of a narrative gets formed very quickly when you kind of look at these clips. And I've seen the clip when Montravius Adams gets into him and he loses leverage a little bit because he is 6'6", loses a bit of leverage, gets shoved into the backfield, and it's an ugly play. But then you could also, in the very same game, see a play where he drives Montravius Adams 5 yards downfield as well. So they kind of, if Adams won one of the snaps, then Pocic won another one. And I think he's just a really solid player. I think the Alabama game is the thing that defines everything with Pocic for me, because it was another game where Leonard Fournette struggled to have any kind of yardage. They couldn't run the ball, and my assumption was, the same as it was the year before in 2015 when the same thing happened for Fournette, was that the offensive line just got overmatched, and they did in 2015. So I expected to watch the 2016 game and see Pocic getting dominated by the Jonathan Allens and Tomlinsons and players like that, and Hand, who's rotating in. So I was kind of expecting a bit of a horror show there, and not at all. Pocic wasn't. I didn't see one negative play from Ethan Pocic in that game. There's a couple of occasions when actually it was kind of his nastiest performance, when he did really finish a couple of blocks and play beyond the whistle and stuff like that. He wasn't pushed around, he wasn't manhandled, he wasn't driven back into the pocket. So there was actually no real reason, other than I think the passing game was so inept, that provoked why Leonard Fournette couldn't run in that game. So there was a lot of positives about Pocic. He's somebody who I feel like in hindsight should have spent a bit more time on. And while he doesn't have kind of like the attitude of a Garrett Bowles, doesn't have kind of that nasty persona, there certainly is I'd say very technically gifted, athletic enough type of player who, for me, I think they've drafted him as a hedge for Justin Britt, because it's going to be very expensive. I think, I think this is, if it is a hedge for Britt, it's a really intelligent move, because the last thing you want to do is get to the end of the year. Justin Britt's had a really good, strong year again, let's assume, and he's asking for $8 to $10 million. And people will say, well, just pay the guy. You've got to pay someone the offensive line. But the Seahawks cap situation will not allow them to do that. They've got about 20 or 30 million for next year. They presume that they're going to want to keep Cam Chancellor, possibly also Jimmy Graham. You are not going to be able to keep Graham, Chancellor, and Justin Britt. You are also, if you might want to keep Luke Jokel, if he has a really good year, you might want to keep Eddie Lacy if he has a good year, or Bradley McDougald. So there's a lot of players that you're going to have to pay. And I think if Justin Britt has a sort of an above average season again, are you going to want to pay him to make him one of the top 5 earners on your team at the expense of losing a Graham or a Chancellor? I don't think it's very likely. Now, if his value is in the 4, 5, 6 million range, you might be more prepared to pay that. But if it's 8 to 10, you're not going to want to pay it. So it serves to have at least somebody who, one, will know the system in a year's time, will know the scheme, has played center, knows the zone blocking scheme as well. So that if you do lose Justin Britt, let's say for $8 to $10 million, not only are you probably going to get a really nice comp pick, maybe even a third rounder for him, which is kind of what you paid a second for him in the first place. You get a third back. If that does happen, then Ethan Pocic can step in and start straight away. You're not having to go and find a bog standard veteran who's going to cost a lot. You're not going to have to go and draft another rookie to go and play that position. You're not going to have to be scrambling around looking for a center. The Seahawks have been ahead of the game here. So the best case scenario is Justin Britt plays well, you re-sign him. Ethan Pocic plays well at right or left guard, you've got him cemented in there. That's the best case scenario. But the worst case scenario is not that bad either. It's that Justin Britt walks and Ethan Pocic takes over, and you feel pretty comfortable about the situation.
After taking care of an offensive line issue with Ethan Pocic. The Seahawks certainly hoped that the most talented bunch in this draft would come between picks 90 and 111 because they had 5 picks in that time. It still sounds crazy to say 5 picks between 90 and 111. The first of those being Shaquille Griffin. Rob, on SeahawksDraftBlog.com, you wrote about Shaquille Griffin and how it could be a signal towards the Seahawks looking to create more turnovers in the future, coupled with Tedric Thompson, who we'll get to shortly. But with Shaquille Griffin, that there would be some issues in terms of, that he's still got a lot of learning to do. I was also interested about how you said that the UCF, Central Florida defensive scheme, is one of the worst you'll ever see. I can't work out what they were trying to do. Can you sort of describe that system that you saw that blew your mind? And in what way will Shaquille Griffin be perhaps put in the position to succeed the most next season and moving forward? Like what player perhaps in Pete Carroll history could you maybe compare him to as that could be his future?
Well, in terms of the defensive scheme that they used there, I just had no idea what they were trying to do because they would have Griffin playing so far off coverage. There was this huge cushion for the receiver. So if they wanted to check it down, throw a short stuff, they were giving up about 4, 5, 6 yards every single time. And then when he was sort of going deeper, what was happening if you were to run sort of like a post or a deep route or anything? Griffin was showing the receiver inside, so into the middle of the field. Now, what cornerbacks will try to do is they will try to force the receiver to the outside to narrow the strike zone of where the quarterback can throw. Because if he's having to throw tight against the sideline, the radius of which the receiver's got to try and make the pass to make the catch is severely reduced. But as soon as you sort of force them inside, you're opening up all of the center field for the quarterback to aim for, and it puts a lot of strain on the free safety. And it puts the cornerback essentially has to be even the best athletes. And Shaq Griffin is the best athlete at cornerback that the Seahawks have drafted so far under Pete Carroll. But even the best athletes are going to really struggle to stick in coverage. And there were a couple. It's to Griffin's credit that there were a couple of times on tape where the receiver was allowed inside and Griffin still caught up, undercut the route, and made a play on the ball. To his credit, not many cornerbacks could do that. But it was just a really strange scheme. And, they gave up big plays. And you would see stuff like, because they were bringing everybody inside, you would see Griffin running into this. There was a couple of big pass plays against UCF where Griffin actually just ran into the safety because they got in each other's way, and then the receiver was away and off. And I think the big play that everyone's looked at, Amara Darboh, who's also a Seahawk, had a big play against Griffin, and that was as a consequence of them running into each other. There was bad angles from the safety. There was this one touchdown in I think it was like the 20-yard line where ran an inside slant, and again Griffin's given up this free release, and the guy just ran an inside slant and just ran in between this huge space between the quarterback and the safety. The quarterback threw the pass. I mean, you could have thrown the pass, Kenny. It was so easy. You could have just thrown it underarm and lobbed it to him, and he just walked in untouched for the touchdown. And it was whoever was the defensive coordinator of that team, I would love to sit them down and say, can you please talk me through what the plan was with this? Because it just made no sense whatsoever. So it's hard to judge him from that defensive scheme. It's hard to sort of say, okay, this is what Shaq Griffin is. I know people have been talking about how he was beaten on plays and he gave up some plays. But if you look, again, you've got to sort of consider that scheme and then sort of say, right, well, what is he? There is evidence of him when he can push them against the sideline. Of running the route, that is what Richard Sherman has done in his career. Run the route for the receiver, gain the position from which to play the ball. He did that a couple of times. You can tell he's a really explosive athlete. I think the one thing I like about him the most, the length, but he's quite big. For somebody who runs a 4.38, he's quite a thick cornerback. We're not talking about a skinny cornerback here. We're talking about somebody who's quite thick in the build. And that should stand him in good stead for playing press and run support. And, we know the Seahawks like to do that. Now, whether or not he's going to be able to, as a rookie, go from, this scheme, which is so different to what the Seahawks run, to, learning the technique for Seattle and starting as a rookie, I'm not entirely confident of that. But I think he's got the sort of the physical skills to give it a shot. And you asked, who does he compare to? I don't think there's anybody. He's very different. He's not a Byron Maxwell. He's not a Brandon Browner. He's not even really a Richard Sherman. He's quite a different player that they've never really had before. They've not had this 4.38 runner who's got the size and the length, who has got this, incredible 11-foot broad jump, huge vertical. I mean, it's not a surprise that they took him earlier than they've ever taken any cornerback, because as a physical specimen, his physical profile is sensational. And, I know that Chris Richard and Pete Carroll want to work with this guy because his upside is through the roof. And you have to say, in fairness, if we're talking about players who are special and, have got the qualities that they would look for, Kevin King was in a different planet in terms of his short area quickness and his deep speed and all, and the explosive traits as well. That, that combination, he was kind of on a different, but everybody else was, Shaquille Griffin's right up there, in terms of the best athletes at cornerback in this class. So I think the Seahawks got a really nice project for themselves at 90. And it would not be a surprise whatsoever if he ends up being a really smart player at the next level, somebody who may even surpass what they've done before at the cornerback position, because if he can learn the technique and get it down, he's got the physical skills to be better than anybody they've had before.
Coming up next is a pick that still remains, I guess, somewhat of a mystery to me. I just feel like for some reason I think about him less than the safety taken after him. Perhaps that's because I just wrote a couple articles about Tedric Thompson on fieldgoals.com today. That's a plug for fieldgoals.com. And on SeahawksDraftBlog.com, you wrote as well about Delano Hill. You guys, there's a bunch of stuff. You got to go to Seahawks Draft Blog to get all the breakdowns that'll go, even deeper. And I'm reading off of the one that you've got on Delano Hill, noting that he's a tackling machine, and that he's got more than ideal size and length, that he really is a rare in that way of his size and length and his ability to do certain things. But with Delano Hill, what were the things about Delano Hill that sort of made him a late third-round pick instead of a first-round pick? And the same with him. Like you know that you can't compare a guy to Cam Chancellor. It's hard to compare a guy to Earl Thomas. But in terms of Delano Hill's future, where do you think that lies?
It's hard to say because he's not an obvious strong safety. In fact, a lot of the time at Michigan, he lined up as a free safety or a single high safety. He kind of did two deep coverages. He did single high. He would come and play in the box. He would act as sort of like the big nickel type of player. I mean, he was incredibly versatile. He would line up in lots of different positions. And I think that he is somebody who they're going to have to work on in certain areas. But what he is he's really tough. I don't think I saw him miss a tackle in the 3 games that I watched. In the Ohio State game, I'm sure a lot of people have gone to that when they wanted to sort of look at what he was about when the Seahawks drafted him. But if you haven't, go and have a look at it. You'll sort of get the best idea of what he is as a player. I mean, he's a tackle machine in that game. He's just flying around the field. One of the things he does really well is cover the flat. So he would line up, the times he lined up in the slot, they would have the outside receiver sort of run inside, run a slant or something like that, pull the cornerback away, and then try and isolate one of their better, athletes at receiver against the safety. And that was no problem at all for Delano Hill. He would rush out to the flat, wrap up, had a couple of big plays there. It was good to see him working against Curtis Samuel in the slot a couple of times. Had a couple of really good plays, in my opinion. One of them was flagged for a pass interference, but I think it was really good coverage, and it showed what he's capable of against a 4-3 runner. He stuck with him and did a very good job there. What you don't see, and this is the problem with safeties, I think that Cam Chancellor has created this really unrealistic perception of what a stronger safety is, and what a big safety can do. I mean, like, people like Earl and Cam are really rare. You don't see safeties flying around the field smashing people into the turf like Cam Chancellor did when he came into the league. It's just, that's not how safeties are. And the ones who are, like Justin Evans, generally tend to whiff a lot on the tackles as well, because they're going for the big hit purposely rather than just sort of going for the tackle. And one thing Hill does is consistently tackle very well. I think that PFF ranked him as 10th for tackling efficiency in 2016. It was almost a little surprised he was only 10th, that he wasn't higher up on that. When he blitzes, he can get a 0 to 60 very quickly. He has got 4.47 speed. So there are lots of things to like. And like I say, he could potentially be a big nickel for the Seahawks. He could cover maybe a little bit at free safety because he's done that, although he's not going to have anywhere near the range that Earl has got. He can maybe play in the box like Cam does as well. But I think that his role as a rookie is going to be fairly limited, I think, at first, to maybe competing for the big nickel with McDougal and giving them an option there for next year if he ends up moving on as a free agent and playing a bit of special teams. Look, Cam didn't play as a rookie. Cam was redshirted as a rookie and played core special teams. I think that's what they're going to ask of Hill initially, that he's going to be a really strong backup option that they really like. And in terms of some of the limitations that he's got, he isn't twitchy, and he's not going to, like I say, he's not going to have the range that Earl had. There was a couple of occasions when he lined up against receivers where he didn't maybe have some of the quickness. I know people have talked about him playing cornerback. I don't think that's a good fit for him at all. But just one final quick interesting note about him. I think that his size is the intriguing thing. I mean, he is 6'1", 216. So he's almost the same size as Deion Jones, the linebacker in Atlanta, had such a good rookie year. Almost the same size as him. But he's got incredible length. Like, his wingspan is 77.5 inches, which is comparable to Kevin King, the 6'3" cornerback. He's actually got a better wingspan than Gary and Conley and Quincy Wilson. It's very similar to Richard Sherman level length. In the Richard Sherman has 80-inch wingspan. It's half an inch less than that. So he has got fantastic length, fantastic size. He runs a 4.4 despite that size. So the Seahawks are probably looking at him and saying, he's tough. He can tackle. He's got a great attitude. He's come from a defense that we have a lot of respect for. He's got the speed and the physicality and the size. We can work with this guy. So I don't think he probably won't have a major impact. He almost certainly won't be a starter unless for injuries as a rookie. But I think he will be a core special teamer, someone that they feel really positive about, someone that can compete for a big nickel maybe as a rookie, but down the line could be a really good pick for them and could end up being a core part of this team.
The Seahawks drafted a defensive tackle at pick 35. We talked about him. You remember the name. It's Malik McDowell, but that didn't stop them there. They had another defensive tackle in mind, that being Nazir Jones of North Carolina. Very productive as a junior. 70 tackles, 9.5 tackles for a loss, 2.5 sacks, 3 batted passes, a forced fumble. I mean, I don't know necessarily how common it is for a defensive tackle to have 70 tackles and 9.5 tackles for a loss in college football. But that seems really, really, really good and highly more productive than your average defensive tackle. That being said, I don't know, guys. I just said I didn't know if that's totally uncommon. It seems like a lot. So that's Nazir Jones in his last year at North Carolina. Perhaps some would say a bigger star than Mitchell Trubisky. Nobody would say that, but they would say that he was drafted by the Seahawks, and that's what happened. Rob, Nazir Jones, as you talked about how it would be fun to see him lined up in base with Jaron Reed, and the long-term future of that, plus Malik McDowell and Quentin Jefferson perhaps coming in for passing downs. And the short shuttle that, reminded me, Quentin Jefferson ran a 4.37. I mean, everyone else you listed, nobody broke 4.4. You've got Jones at 4.63, McDowell at 4.53, Jordan Hill at 4.51, Jay Howard at 4.47, and Quentin Jefferson 4.37 again. So, Jefferson was someone that played really well in training camp last year, and then an injury cost him pretty much all of his season. So he's a guy that we sort of figured about. But now the Seahawks come back next year, maybe no Tony McDaniel, but they've got Jaron Reed and Atiba Rubin, and they've added Malik McDowell and Naz Jones, plus they could be getting Quentin Jefferson back. This defensive tackle position, I don't want to say that it's ever seemed like a that big of a, like, not the biggest hole on the roster. It just seemed like it became that way by midseason or late in the season with injuries, and that those guys just seem to almost be contagious with their injuries, and one falls, 4 fall. So this time they seem to have perhaps their best group of defensive tackles in the Pete Carroll era. Maybe do you think that this could be the best group of defensive tackles? And how excited are you for Naz Jones as compared to maybe like Malik McDowell or Jaron Reed? How does he stack up?
I'm very excited about Nazir Jones, and I think that there's a great chance. Look, it doesn't necessarily happen. It'll be a major boon for the Seahawks if they hit on all of these players. Or was it like 6 in the first 3 rounds, and then Tedric Thompson to follow after that? It's unlikely that all of these players are going to hit, but it is such an interesting group of guys. And Jones kind of encapsulates that. And I know that people are kind of feel, immediately after the draft, there was kind of this disappointment. They didn't draft Kevin King, and I know him because he's from Washington. And they could have had Cam Robinson or Forrest Lamp, and people were all disappointed. And yet, I think if people dig into these players and look, there's a breakdown on all of the players drafted in the first 4 rounds on Seahawks draft blog at the moment, I would recommend going and reading those pieces, not just because I've written them, but because it just tells you how excited you should be about this group, because it's going to make the Seahawks more competitive. It's going to make them deeper at positions. One of the issues last year was the fact that their depth at secondary was not good enough. And we've just talked about, Delano Hill improves that. Tedric Thompson improves that. Shaquille Griffin improves that. And, you're talking about this, is this the best defensive line group? That I think without a shadow of a doubt it is, because if you get Quinton Jefferson back, as you mentioned there, short area quickness is superb. I really like what we saw from him a year ago in terms of what he showed at Maryland. And he could be the Clinton McDonald type of play. It could be someone who can get you sort of 4 to 5 sacks working on the interior. I think that Nazir Jones and Malik McDowell, McDowell again is going to be a bit of an impact pass rusher inside and maybe can play some end. And then with Nazir Jones, I think what you're getting is a guy with Red Bryant's type of character. He's kind of that fiery personality. I could imagine him within a couple of years becoming quite a presence in the locker room, being one of their leaders. He's an emotional leader for North Carolina. You sort of see that intensity there, plays like his hair's on fire. He's got this, like McDowell, he's got nearly 35-inch arms and, 6'5". What you're going to find is that Seahawks have really struggled against kind of shorter, quicker routes, haven't they? Over the last couple of years, where teams have been able to kind of dink and dunk to success against this defense. Good luck doing that if you've got this guy and Malik McDowell with the length they've got, standing at the line of scrimmage, getting their arms up and blocking passes, because they're going to bat down a lot of passes this year. I'm sure about that. And you sort of see the quickness with him. He can flash, he can burst through. He's got some endeavor that I think if people want to see a good example of what he shows, go and watch the bowl game against Stanford. You should be able to find that on YouTube. Go and watch it. There's one sack where he sort of plows through a couple of different blockers to get through to the Stanford quarterback. And I know a lot of people after that game were looking at Solomon Thomas, but Nazir Jones had a really good game as well for North Carolina there. And I just think that with his ability I think can be a better pass rusher than people realize. And I think over time he could develop into that. But I also think he's kind of that base type of player that he might not start immediately. It might be Jaron Reed and Ataba Rubin who are the sort of starters on rundowns, and then they'll come off the field. Maybe Quinton Jefferson and Malik McDowell will come in there. There'll be a bit of Nazir Jones. But I think that over time he can be sort of a Tony McDaniel plus, someone who can be really stout against the run, but he's going to offer them a bit more as a pass rusher as well. And that's kind of what they need. They need players who, they're going to be stout. They're going to show good gap discipline, if I put my teeth in it, and have that sort of solidity to play early downs, but can also create a little bit more when teams do want to throw on early downs as well. And I think that's what Nazir Jones is going to provide. And he could end up being quite the all-round defensive lineman for them, and he could be a leader. So I think this is a really good pick for the Seahawks. I think the value is perfectly matched in round 3. I think he's that type of player. Once going into that 3rd round range, and you see it time and time. Defensive tackles who go in the 3rd or the 4th round end up having a big impact. So I think that the Seahawks have got well worth taking a punt on this guy, and a really interesting pick for them.
And as you said, seven picks in the top 111. That means a full draft class of 7 picks, which would be your regular amount of draft picks that a team could have with no comp picks or whatever. But doing that all in the top 50% of the actual draft class, I mean, they are injecting a serious amount of hope, at least, into the youth side of this roster, with them saying these are all of these guys that we're adding to the team that were picks that we almost never would cut before going into a season. So it's like that's a pretty big statement, and the fact that they didn't trade those picks and didn't move up. So we're just about to talk about the 6th guy on this list. We've been talking on this podcast for a while. We're just trying to go through the thing, and we haven't even gotten out of the 3rd round. So Seattle adding a lot of talent in those first 3 rounds, and then really Tedric Thompson being in there too. And that next guy being Amara Darboh. We talked a lot about Jehu Chesson, the wide receiver at Michigan, and he did overshadow perhaps Amara Darboh. But Darboh, now that we've had hindsight as well to look at the Amara Darboh pick, I think it was a well-liked pick at the time. But, Rob, as you've had more time to look it over with Amara Darboh, there are opportunities, it seems, with this group of receivers for somebody to step up and for somebody to be like, other than Doug Baldwin, I'm going to be the guy, because Tyler Lockett, even when healthy, was inconsistent. And, I know people will fight me on that, but I'm pretty comfortable in saying that so far through 2 seasons, Tyler Lockett has flashed greatness, gotten injured, and also been inconsistent and not had very good games, or games where he completely disappeared. Or maybe, and even if the defense is trying to take him out, that still separates the players, the receivers that can just not be taken out of a game, and the ones that can. So, there's something to be said about that, even though Tyler Lockett's got a long future and he's got a lot more, room to get better. And he could step up and be like the best receiver on this team, no doubt about it. But then they've also got Paul Richardson, who can't stay healthy, and Jermaine Kearse, who's just was horrible last season, and Tanner McAvoy, who's still a raw project, and it's certainly not guaranteed a spot next year, though he has the opportunities for sure to lock that in with more growth and advancement. But the Seahawks don't necessarily need the fastest receiver or the biggest receiver or the most talented receiver, because as Doug Baldwin has shown, they can take an undrafted free agent and make him one of the top 10, or he can become one of the top 10 receivers in the NFL, which I think Doug Baldwin is. But who else is going to step up besides Doug Baldwin? Who else is going to be a threat besides Jimmy Graham? Do you see Amara Darboh as more of a functional receiver, a Jermaine Kearse, a very good player who does all the right things, but maybe comes out with 500 and 600 yards in a season? Or do you see him having a ceiling that goes way beyond that? Because, it's interesting, the players that the Seahawks, the receivers that the Seahawks have drafted in this range during the Pete Carroll era, in that second or third round range, is Golden Tate, Paul Richardson, and Tyler Lockett. But also when you get into that 4th round, Kevin Norwood and Chris Durham. So they've had their really big misses in the 4th round. Chris Harper, another one being there. What do you think separates Amara Darboh from those 3 complete busts, and maybe being the guy that is going to stick around and have a good career with Seattle?
Well, I don't know. He may well be the next bust. We just have to wait and see there. In terms of what separates him, I suppose you could say that he is the best athlete they've drafted, I think, at the position, overall athlete. Obviously Richardson was very quick, Tyler Lockett very quick. But I think in terms of overall athleticism, Darboh is the best. He's a little bit raw because he's come to the game late. And while you sort of see at Michigan, he showed pretty good growth as a player in the last 2 years. I still think there's steps for him to go to get even better. And in terms of what his role is going to be, I think as a rookie, it's going to be fairly limited. We've seen this with receivers in the past. Even with, I think Doug Baldwin's the only one who's come in and had a really immediate impact as a rookie. Maybe Lockett, you could argue as well. But I think that he will be brought along fairly slowly. It's funny that he compares quite favorably to Ricardo Lockett, who had a major impact on special teams, and I think that might be the best thing for him immediately, is just sort of get stuck into special teams, have that kind of, be a gunner, be that type of a player in year one. And I think the reason they drafted him, and maybe the reason they felt it was important to draft a receiver this year, is because Paul Richardson's out of contract in a year's time. Jermaine Kearse is quite a favorable cap casualty at the end of the year. I think they can save something like $4 or $5 million by moving him in 2018. So, unless he has a really spectacular bounce back year in 2017, you would imagine that he's going to get cut. He may even get cut anyway, and then they sort of let him sort of see the lay of the land and might even bring him back on a cheaper deal if they wanted to. So, the chances are that Kearse will go. Lockett's injury exists, therefore they have to see whether he can come back and make a full recovery. Jimmy Graham's out of contracts, Luke Wilson's out of contract, so you're talking about a lot of players that are, their futures are uncertain. You could even look at someone like Tanner McAvoy. What is he actually? He's already in his mid-20s, so is he a player that's going to, suddenly take this huge step forward and become a real productive player, or is he is what he is? The guy who can make an occasional play here or there. So they needed to bring our receiver in. And now it's up to Darboh to sort of prove over time. I'm sure they will give him the time to develop and learn and stuff like that. And I think that if people want to know what he is, or what he's capable of, they should, again, go and find that Michigan-Ohio State game towards the end of last year. It was a crucial game for both teams. There is a play in overtime. So the game goes to overtime. If you don't know the college overtime rules, both teams have a possession. Ohio State had scored their touchdown from their possession. So Michigan had to score a touchdown, otherwise it was game over. 4th down in the red zone. Game's on the line. You have to make a play at this point. Darboh's lined up across from Marshawn Lattimore, who was the number 11 overall pick to New Orleans. So it's Darboh against Lattimore. Lattimore ran a 4.3 something, 4.38, I think. Darboh wins with a beautiful little sidestep and then sort of feints to the outside and then darts inside on a slant and creates, more than enough just perfect separation between himself and the number 11 overall pick. Inside slant, quarterback throws it low. It's a bit of an awkward catch for him, but he still goes down and makes the play. It extends the game. If Darboh doesn't make that play against Marshawn Lattimore, it's game over. And I guarantee that every single scout in the NFL who was pushing for Amara Darboh to be drafted by their team was putting that play on the big screen every single day that they discuss wide receivers, because you want to see your wide receiver against the best. That's the top cornerback taken in the draft. That's the top athlete at cornerback supposedly taken in the draft. And you've just seen Amara Darboh pull a move like that to get open. That's his ceiling. Now, it's not all positive. There are some plays that, you think, you wonder about his athleticism, his ability to separate on other occasions. But then you go back to the Lattimore play and you're just so impressed with it. I don't think he was helped by the Michigan quarterback. Spade, the quarterback at Michigan, threw a lot of inaccurate passes, made him work on a lot of passes, throw just behind, throw a little bit too high, stuff like that. So I think playing with a much more accurate quarterback will help him. But, he's a great athlete, seems to have a great attitude. He's got this fantastic backstory, which is, heartwarming to read about. And, you want to root for the guy. And has got the play against Lattimore. And that's all you really need to know, is that play against Lattimore shows what he is capable of. So, the chance of him becoming a DeAndre Hopkins may be somewhat limited, especially in Seattle's offense. Can he be a role player for the Seahawks going forward? Yes. Is he going to be a Jermaine Kearse type player? Possibly. I seem to think maybe he might be a little bit different than anything they've had before. Somebody who maybe even more of a Sidney Rice. He's not the same type of player as Sidney Rice, but somebody who, like your number 1 outside, if you want to classify Baldwin as kind of a slot outside hybrid, but someone who can act sort of like a 700-800 yard receiving type of player on the outside. That might be what his ceiling is within Seattle's offense, but somebody who is quite reliable, somebody who will make plays, and someone who is going to run block particularly well. And I think that's kind of what they like about him as well.
Another fun fact about Amara Darboh is that the last season in week 2 against Central Florida, where Shaquille Griffin plays, 5 catches for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then the next week against Colorado, where Tedric Thompson plays, 2 catches for 51 yards and a touchdown. And then later in the season, he had 8 catches and 165 yards against Michigan State, where Malik McDowell plays. So a lot of Seahawks type stuff going on with this schedule here for maybe Michigan. And, there's also Delano Hill. So they obviously watch a lot of Jim Harbaugh games. But like it was said, that 2 catch of 51 yards and a touchdowns against against Colorado, that Colorado secondary having 3 players drafted in the first 4 rounds. The third of them being Tedric Thompson, the safety. Wrote about him on Field Goals Today, where I sort of talked about how he was Pro Football Focus's best coverage defender in the nation last year. Rob, you've mentioned his 23 pass breakups, which led the nation. And he had 7 interceptions. He came up big in the big games a lot of the times, and certainly was highly productive and relied upon, and was a veteran presence for Colorado, as they had this really talented secondary. And it seemed like Tedric Thompson maybe got lost a little bit behind Chidobe Awuzie and Ahkello Witherspoon You can watch a really interesting video that his brother recorded on draft weekend. Again, you can go to Field Goals for that, where it was sort of just a 12-minute sort of mini documentary about Tedric Thompson waiting for his name to be called and not having it happen on day 1 and day 2, and sort of the agony of that matched with the ecstasy of him getting the phone call from John Schneider and breaking down and crying, on camera and all that kind of stuff. So good stuff there. But Tedric Thompson just seems like the type of guy you want to root for, and that, and is a good player and has risen up the boards, perhaps in my heart, to be maybe my favorite player of this class right now. Rob, I know that you agree that you like Tedric Thompson, but if you want to expand and say what's exciting perhaps about his future and, of how good of a value it would be, how good of a value was he there at the top of the 4th round, or is that about where he should go?
No, I thought it was fantastic value there, and I think the Seahawks played a blinder getting him in the early 4th round. It's a terrific pick. It's the only pick during the draft I actually did a little fist bump with when the Seahawks took him, because I think it was just a really good value pick. But I will say this, and I'll start with a minor sort of negative. If we're going to say that the scheme hindered Shaquille Griffin, we should be honest and say that the scheme probably helped Tedric Thompson, or at least the play of others around him helped him. One thing, Colorado's defense is almost the complete opposite of UCF's. So while UCF were getting their cornerbacks to play off and then move all the receivers inside, it completely differently, the right way, essentially. It's not a surprise that they had quite a good year overall. The cornerbacks, the 2 outside cornerbacks, were very, very good at sort of forcing the receivers against the sideline. The Seahawks call it, I think, winning the red line. And, you see a lot of the red lines on the practice fields at a lot of teams these days. They get the cornerbacks to push the receiver outside, narrow the strike zone at the sideline, and it makes life easier for the defense to cover those players. And one thing Colorado does, if you watch any amount of Colorado tape, you sort of see the receivers jammed up against the sideline. And what that allowed Tedric Thompson to do was to sort of read what the quarterback was going to do, and anything that was thrown deep, if it was thrown into an area where there's very little room for the receiver to make a play, there's actually a lot of room for the free safety to come across and make a play. So as long as he had the range to get across, which he did, then he can play the ball, whether it's to break it up and make interceptions. So it's not a big surprise that he had 7 interceptions. It's very similar. Kind of Earl Thomas had 8 interceptions, Malik Hooker. The teams that play this kind of defense pretty well will create opportunities for the safeties. So I think you kind of have to mention that before you go on talking about Tedric Thompson. But that said, you look at him and the way that he tested, he didn't test anywhere near as well as Cedric, his brother, which was a bit of a surprise. But when you actually watch the games, you don't watch him and think, wow, I'm watching a much better athlete than a 4.60 runner here. But he still seems to get around the field, even though he doesn't seem to be moving particularly fast. You see the range. He, again, like Delano Hill, is very good at covering passes into the flat. He does move up to the slot at times. He's not the kind of technique tackler that Delano Hill is. I think Hill's tackling technique is very good. Thompson's is not, but he gets the job done. He will get players down on the turf. There are some really instinctive interceptions amongst the ones where he's just kind of covering and playing range. He has 2 or 3 interceptions. I watched 2 games in particular where I think he had 3 interceptions. They were all like, if people remember the Atlanta playoff game in 2012, the one where they lost with the field goal late on. Russell Wilson's rookie season, there was an interception there where Earl Thomas kind of sprinted across the sideline and made the pick. There were sort of 3 interceptions just like that. And the other thing that I really liked about Tedric Thompson was the way he covered tight ends in the Utah game. They kind of had the tight end, blocked down and then sort of settled behind the line of scrimmage and sort of sit on the front of the end zone. And they tried to throw a little, just dump it off to him really and try and sort of hide him as he was blocking down and then sort of move behind the line of scrimmage. And Tedric Thompson spotted this in an instant, anticipates the throw, rushes in and gets a hand on the ball just as it's reaching the tight end from the pass. And he tips it up in the air and it falls incomplete. So it was nearly intercepted. And the tight end's reaction is fantastic. It's just like, whoa, what happened there? Where did he come from? He kind of just stands there with his hands up in the air like, wow, how did you stop that? And it just, the instinct, the reactions, the burst to get there and break that play up was fantastic. And then in the same game at the other end of the field, they had him covering a tight end in the slot and he ran an inside, the little slant route inside. And Thompson's perfect technique, because he's kind of, anticipates. He's got his hands on him. He understands. He's got a feel for where he's going to go. The throw comes in. It's quite a quick throw in the red zone. He undercuts the route and he plays the ball like a cornerback. And it's that kind of thing that gets you excited, because you know what? You see enough plays with him. He's playing in range and he's playing at free safety, and he can do all that stuff. But when he's sort of working in the slot against a tight end and he's making plays like that, and you can see the reactions, you can see sort of the natural feel for being a defensive back, then it does get you excited. I'm not surprised at all that he led the country in pass breakups, 7 interceptions, because you sort of see lots of interesting traits, lots of interesting things you can work on. So might not be the best athlete, but a really interesting player. And the other thing is the Seahawks didn't really have anybody who was even remotely like Earl Thomas. And Thompson's not got the intensity of Earl Thomas or the athleticism of Earl Thomas, but he is at least somebody who could play single high, free safety, and you would not be, really, really, really concerned about it. And he's done it before, and he's done it in college and in a defense that plays in a kind of a similar way to the Seahawks. So I think that is a reassuring aspect of this pick as well. And as we started talking about Tedric Thompson, Kenny, I just think the value of this pick, to get a player as good as that at the start of round 4, is fantastic. And I think John Schneider mentioned that 6 of their first 7 picks, they had a second round grade on. That's what he said. I think he would have just said 6 of our first 6 if he was talking about all the guys in round 2 and round 3. The fact that he mentioned 6 of the first 7, and that goes all the way up to Tedric Thompson, suggests that they had a second round grade on Tedric Thompson, which would not surprise me at all. He's a really good player.
The Seahawks didn't have their own 4th round pick this year because they traded it to the Patriots last year. The Patriots chose Dietrich Wise, defensive end out of Arkansas. Some of the players, there were some players that they potentially missed out on there, but I think that, as we talked previously about Quentin Jefferson, probably good to have Quentin Jefferson and maybe, think less about whatever guys they may have missed out on. The guys that went in that range were Donnell Pumphrey, Ryan Switzer, Zach Banner, Ryan Glasgow, Jehu Chesson, who we just talked about, but whatever. And they didn't have their 5th round pick either because it was docked for the practice violations. If they had that pick, there were guys out there, but not a ton that we even mentioned that much. Caleb Brantley, but then maybe they don't pick up that 6th round pick, which is where they got pick 187 and chose Mike Tyson, safety out of Cincinnati. They had their own 6th round pick where they chose Justin Senior, tackle out of Mississippi State. They added another 7th round pick. They chose David Moore, wide receiver out of East Central Oklahoma. And then with their own 7th round pick, or a late 7th round pick, because I think they traded their 7th round pick to Oakland, but with their late 7th round pick, Chris Carson, running back out of Oklahoma State. So they had added 4 other players after those first 7. And these last 4 may have longer shots to make the final roster, but certainly in the running. And it'll be interesting to see more of what these guys like David Moore have to bring. Rob, with these last 4 picks, did you have any further time to study or reflect or use hindsight to think about these picks, whether who these guys are individually or what the moves mean for the roster in a more broad sense?
I think a lot of it's down to competition. There's no tape of Moore of any note, so it's really impossible to judge him. Carson, they seem to sign Mike Davis today, so they seem to have about 14 running backs and fullbacks on the roster. So, a guy they can bring in to compete. I did watch a bit of him during the season, and I think we earmarked him. After the combine, I wrote a piece, and people can go and check this out. But we wrote a piece saying, he fits. There was only like 2 or 3 guys who actually fit the parameters of a Seahawks running back, in terms of what they looked for in the past: size, explosion, stuff like that. He was only one of 3 players that they would look at, so they ended up drafting him. Not a big surprise there. Ran tough last year, didn't do so in the past, but somebody can come in and compete. Like the idea of that as a 7th round flyer. Senior had a really rough start at the Senior Bowl. If anybody sort of saw the workouts they do at the Senior Bowl, the best bit is when the offensive and the defensive linemen go up against each other. And Senior was going to call up to the Senior Bowl the week before it began. He was going to be at the Shrine game, but then chose to go to the Senior Bowl instead because of the late call up. He struggled mightily on the first day, and it was just embarrassing. It was tough to watch. he was that bad. You just felt really sorry for him, really, because he was just getting overmatched over and over again. But as the week progressed, you could see that he was taking to the coaching, his technique was starting to improve, and he was having more success. So, I think that's probably one of the things the Seahawks like about him, is that this is a guy that has shown he can take to coaching. I think I've not looked back at his 2015 stuff, but people say that his 2015 tape was better than 2016. I think John Schneider mentioned that he was maybe a little bit, his weight situation was a bit rough in 2016, so they can get him in shape. And if he can take to coaching, which he showed at the Senior Bowl, then that's somebody they could bring in to compete there at defensive line and maybe force his way into the reckoning. But again, there's a lot of numbers there at the moment, so may struggle to do that. Tyson is just a gritty little player. There's a bit of tape on him out there. His personality he's kind of got. He reminded me a little bit with the way he talks. Is a little bit like Thomas Rawls. He's not maybe quite as engaging as Thomas Rawls, but he's kind of got a similar voice and mannerisms a little bit. And I think that he plays with an intensity on the field. And they've talked about trying him at cornerback, but I think these are all guys that I think the meat of this draft is in the first 4 rounds. They're the 7 guys who are almost certain to make the roster. And then when you look at the players drafted in round 6 and 7, it's just about where can you add more competition. I think if they'd got the round 5 pick, they probably would have taken one of the tight ends. I think John Stoner hinted at that. There was a couple of guys that went back to back that they were thinking of maybe trading up for, or if they'd had a pick in that range, they would have loved. Jake Butt went in the 5th round, which was a steal. And George Kittle went in the 5th round, which was also a steal, to San Francisco. And Butt went to Denver. So they're 2 players they may have looked at there. But no biggie. They move on, and I think the competition in round 6 and 7 are just making it a bit more interesting. But maybe a stretch for some of those guys to actually make the final roster, given the competition that's already at the position that they play.
The Seahawks had the most undrafted free agents in the NFL last season. It's a running theme with Pete Carroll, and undrafted free agents know that if they come to Seattle, even if the position they play seems loaded. Now, I wouldn't necessarily still pick the Seahawks if, say, right now, if I was a running back, it does seem pretty daunting. If I was, a defensive tackle, even now, that seems kind of daunting, though, not impossible. But some positions seem a little bit more loaded than others, for sure. But certainly one of them that has plenty of openings is offensive line. And I know Jordan Roos, the guard out of Purdue, got a $20,000 bonus. That being said, like anybody that they signed as an undrafted free agent, you would think still has to some degree, well, certainly, like I just talked about the positions, but to some degree, they felt the guy that they most had to secure was Chris Carson, the pick out of Oklahoma State. If there was a small hierarchy, though, they knew that it would be tough to convince Chris Carson to come to Seattle, perhaps because of what I mentioned about the running back situation. That being, and an offensive guard like Jordan Roos knows that the positions at starter and certainly backup are up for grabs. Did anyone grab your attention, Rob, in the undrafted free agents, with time coming, with a little bit more time separating us from last weekend? And did you have any time to do a little bit more digging on Roos?
I think that he's probably the most interesting one. He was quite the TEF star, the formula that we do. He scored like 3.38, which would have made him by far the most explosive offensive lineman at the combine if he'd gone there. That was in part due to the incredible number of bench reps that he put up. So that that impacted his score quite highly. I've not seen a great deal of his tape. I've watched the 2015 game where Purdue played Michigan State because it was Malik McDowell essentially against Roos, but they didn't really come up against each other. To sort of be able to judge Roos in terms of how he got in that matchup. I think that he was the one they spoke very highly of. I think they paid him $20,000 to sign, which was their biggest outlay on a free agent. But I always find it interesting. They always, if you're going to talk about a guy like that, you're going to say, we really wanted this guy and we spent $20,000 on him. Why didn't they draft him in the end? And they must have really liked the guys they drafted in the 6th and 7th round if they, took a chance on this guy in undrafted free agency. Apart from, aside from that, some of the others, it was a bit of a low key undrafted free agent class. In the past, I think last year was a great example of this. They brought in all these undrafted free agents, and it was like, wow, we remember him, and we know him, and we know him. We've looked at him and thought he might be an option. He's really athletic, and this year there doesn't seem to be that same kind of buzz. They brought in a bunch of guys, people don't know about them. I guess Swoops is an interesting one at tight end. He's got great physicality. Is he somebody they could mold? Would they be able to stash him on the practice squad for a year? Is he somebody that, either during the season or down the line they could protect on the roster, has got some talent there. Be very interesting to see how he copes in camp and preseason to see if he can make it work at tight end. A lot of people seem to like the fullback. I've not watched a lot of him, to be honest. I've not seen him at running back and what he can provide as a fullback, but I think he was very athletic, and the fullback position is going to be one that's going to be very competitive. And I think what they will end up doing is, sort of getting into camp, seeing how the likes of Cottam and Algernon and the other fullback types they have on the roster compete, and if not, maybe bring back Marcel Reese if they need to, but give the younger guys a chance first, maybe. And I think that's pretty much it. There wasn't really anything else that stood out that much this year in terms of undrafted free agents, but the thing is when you draft 11 players, there aren't that many spots on the roster. There isn't that opportunity to go out and bring loads of those guys in. And in fairness to them, like I say, the first seven picks they made in this draft, you'd expect all seven to make the roster and improve the roster and make it, make that middle class of the roster even stronger. So as a consequence, there's maybe not going to be as many opportunities for the undrafted free agents, maybe not quite the need to go and get as many as they have in previous years.
So just to recap the rookies that the Seahawks have brought in, draft picks, undrafted free agents, but I'm pretty much just talking about free agents in this, about the drafted guys. Maybe just some quick hitter questions, Rob. So I'll just give you a pretty simple question, and then you can hit me with your answer, whatever your gut says, perhaps in some of these cases. But now that you've had a week to go over these guys, the first 7 picks and all that kind of stuff, do you have a personal favorite, who's the guy that you're most excited to see on an NFL field next season?
Well, I guess you'd have to say Malik McDowell, just because of the potential, and if it works out for him and he can be as good as anywhere near as good as the Seahawks seem to believe he could be, then you're looking at a really exciting player. And I want to see what he's like in a pro team. I want to see what he's like lined up next to Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill and Frank Clark and people like that, to see if he can have the kind of pro career that his talent promised. I mean, I put a video on the blog of him doing some drills in high school, and he's just got a natural brilliance to him, and he's obviously been destined for greatness for a long time, and maybe this is the best thing for him. Maybe if he's been on this trajectory of like everybody knows he's going to be amazing, 5-star recruit, looked so good in high school, looked the part, has been kind of talked about as a top 10 pick from day one. Maybe it will humble him a little bit to fall away to 35 and make him realize, look, if you want to do what everyone's been saying you're going to do, then you're going to have to work for this, at least for the first 4 years when you get the big contract. So I think he's the one that I'm most excited about looking at. I think my personal favorite picks are the secondary picks, because I just think that the Seahawks have got the greatest defensive back coach in the league as the head coach of the team. Pete Carroll knows defensive backs, and I think that Chris Richard has come through and has had a hand in coaching these guys when they were younger, and then has become the defensive coordinator. And I think the Seahawks have got a really good defensive back group, staff. So the chance to sort of see Shaquille Griffin and Tedric Thompson and Delano Hill and Tyson and whoever else sort of working with these guys, I think is exciting. But it's hard to look beyond Malik McDowell as the player that you're most looking forward to seeing next year.
This may be a tougher question to answer, but I'm still going to, implore you to give your best answer that you can, which is, and I made a 53-man roster projection, and it wasn't hard for me to keep all of the first 7 picks. They were on the roster when I finished my write-up, and I don't think any of them were tough to add. That being said, it is still 7 new players on a highly competitive team, and maybe this is a year where a 3rd or early 4th round pick doesn't make the team. So of the players the Seahawks drafted in that top 7, who do you think is the most likely to, not make the team and perhaps get released during final cuts?
Well, I think it's very hard to sort of project any of them to be cut outright. I guess you the only one you could maybe point to is someone like Tedric Thompson, just because they have cut fourth round picks before. Chris Harper, for example, was cut before the season began, but that was seen as like a real anomaly. That's something that doesn't usually happen. So I don't think there's any chance of the top 7 being cut at all. I think they'll, even if someone like Thompson had a slightly underwhelming camp, it would have taken somebody like I don't think Tyson, because I think he's a totally different player, but it would take somebody else sort of really stepping up to the plate. They don't have any depth at safety, so they need these guys. So I think it's almost impossible to imagine any kind of scenario where they're cut before the season begins.
Their late round picks were, again, Mike Tyson, Justin Sr., Chris Carson, and David Moore. Out of the late round picks and undrafted free agents, who do you think has the best chance to make the team next season?
It's a difficult one because we have to see how these guys take to it. I mean, like if Justin Senior comes in shape and takes to the coaching again, because there are needs on the offensive line, and because that could be an area where competition is more heated because people are legitimately competing for spots there, then he is somebody who could maybe come in and make it stick. That said, like, are you going to bet against them coaching Tyson up to being a productive player? Probably not. You're not going to bet against it. I think Moore will find it difficult because there is quite a lot of competition at wide receiver, and they've taken one in round 3 as well. But I think he's kind of a guy that I would just have a look at this guy. We might not be able to get him in undrafted free agency, so we'll essentially have him as a priority free agent. We'll take him in the 7th round. And Carson's kind of in a similar position. He's got really nothing to lose. They've stocked up these running backs. They're going to give them all a try. So, let's see if he can be the one to stand out a little bit. But it's going to be hard for him because in the way there's the Mike Davis guy who's been picked up today. There's already Alex Collins on the roster. You have to presume that Eddie Lacy, CJ Procise, and Thomas Rawls kind of locked in there. So if they carry a fullback as well, you may be sort of thinking one more spot between Collins and Carson and Davis and everybody else, Pope and everybody else that they've got. So that's going to be an incredibly competitive group. I'm not sure they're going to keep all of these guys until camp. Surely some of them are going to get cut after the mini camps and stuff they've got coming up. But that's going to be tough for Carson to stick with that group there.
That's all I've got for quick hitting questions on the 2017 Seahawks rookie class. And I think, unless I'm mistaken, that's all we got for the show. Rob, was there anything else that you wanted to discuss in terms of these rookies or the draft class in general? And now that we're moving past it, the Seahawks, I mean, if we wanted to talk about anything Seahawks related, they claimed 49ers running back Mike Davis off waivers today, a 4th round pick in 2015. And there's another running back added to the fold. I think probably has a low percentage shot of making the final roster. Any thoughts on the Mike Davis pick?
Well, he was a VMAC visitor in 2015, and he was a player we talked about quite a lot at the time. Somebody I'd doing a couple of mock drafts where we put him to the Seahawks, and he's a tough physical runner. He's very good catcher of the ball. I'm not sure why it hasn't worked for him at San Francisco. I'm not really looked into the backstory there, whether or not he's been injured and stuff like that. He's the kind of player that I would have thought that Kyle Shanahan would have liked to have a look at. And they're not particularly deep at running back. So, I'm a bit surprised they've released him. Not surprised until the Seahawks picked him up because, like I say, he visited the team before the draft in 2015. So not a big surprise there. In terms of overall thoughts on the draft class, I mean, I would just implore Seahawks fans, and I've seen immediately after the draft, I think some of it's kind of died down now. Maybe people have just sort of moved on to other things in their life. But I would implore Seahawks fans to be positive about this draft class. They've filled a lot of the needs that people wanted them to fill during the season or at the end of the season. They brought in a lot of players who have got potential to stick. There are in McDowell and Pocic and Griffin at the very least. They've got 3 players that you could imagine starting for quite a long time in Seattle. And then when you sort of look at Hill and you look at Nazir Jones, you say they could be players that even if they're just sort of secondary or backup type players, that they could have quite an important role to play still. And it's that kind of like middle class of the roster, which hasn't been as strong as it has in 2013, 2014, which they're starting to get back again. Darboh could have an impact, even if he's just a great special teamer for a 3rd round pick. It's worth having. and then you sort of go into the Tedric Thompson, the guys we talked about. I think this is a really solid draft class. It's not the kind of draft class that's going to make headlines. It's not the kind of draft class that's going to get you an A+ from Mel Kiper or Todd McShay or people like that. What it is, though, is it makes sense. It's just makes sense from start to finish. The plan that they did, the way they executed it. I think it's a well-crafted group of players that can help the Seahawks in a much more superior way. I've sort of listened to people talking and saying, I'm sick of the way that they do this and trading down, and they should have just traded up for one guy. Well, that's fine. And if they'd have traded up for one guy, they might have had one impact player from this draft class. I think what we've seen here and what we've talked about over the last hour, Kenny, is that they could have 6 or 7 guys who have an impact on this roster, which is much more important. And it's not that long ago that people were saying, trade down. It's what the Patriots do every year. That's the best way to draft. So, I think there are some very clear reasons why they've done this. I think it is a good draft class. Whether or not the Seahawks can get back to the kind of level they were at 2 or 3 years ago is a completely separate matter. A lot of it's going to come down to health. A lot of it's going to be how that offensive line and the running game performs this year, because they are 2 areas that have to be better in 2017. They cannot have 25th or 26th best run game again this year. They can't have the offensive line playing the way it is. I think the defense will be just fine, especially with the additions that they've made and the better depth they've got this year. So the defense I'm not worried about at all. They didn't trade Richard Sherman, so that's not a hole they've created there. The defense looks solid. It's really going to come down to the Seahawks season. It's probably going to come down to the health of Wilson, their ability to protect him, their ability to run the ball better, to have consistency and health at running back, to try and reassert themselves as a physical force. I think that being able to go on the road again and give people a blooded nose, which they didn't really do last year or the year before, is important again, even when they're not winning games, to sort of be really physical and tough. I think it will help the Seahawks immensely if the NFC West takes a step back this year, which seems realistic. And I think it was really encouraging. A lot of people were praising what the Cardinals did in the draft. I thought it was really encouraging to see that the Cardinals did not draft just a quarterback of note. So they're banking on Carson Palmer this year, and what are they doing for the future? It's not entirely clear what their plan is, unless they did intend to spend a lot of money on Kirk Cousins or Jimmy Garoppolo in a year, if they are even in a position to do that, depending on franchise tags and alike, and competition from other teams. So it doesn't really seem like they've addressed the future of that team. They've kind of just filled some of the holes that they created themselves with their cap situation on defense. So if the NFC West takes a step back, that will help the Seahawks. And it's a long wait now. What is it? Sort of the 9th of May. Things don't really start to kick into action now until kind of like July, August time. So it's a bit of a long way. It's a shame. It's the worst type of the year for NFL fans because you've got to wait it out now. But I think the one sort of final note I would say is for Seahawks fans to be positive about this draft class, because I think if you study it and you look at the players and you sort of put things into perspective and you kind of try and think about what they did and stuff like that, you will feel really good about this draft.
I was just looking up dates, actually, and the Seahawks OTA offseason workouts. So those particular things, if you want, just so people know what's coming up, offseason workouts for OTAs go from May 30th to June 9th. Mandatory mini camp is from June 13th to June 15th. Last year, tickets for training camp opened up at around July 30th, or June 27th, and then training camp opened on July 30th of last year. So the Seahawks are about a little more than a month out from mandatory mini camps, and OTAs are just about 3 weeks out. So things are coming up, and we'll get a better idea of some of these guys and what the hype is around some of these rookies, and then also how people are sliding in with the veterans. And then, as Rob said, we're looking at August pretty much for that training camp buzz, that training camp that you stick straight into your veins and get high off of. So that's it for 3000 NFL Mock Draft this week. You can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten and go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Me, I can be found at Field Goals at fieldgoals.com. And us, you can find us always at 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Subscribe on iTunes through the title Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, or just watch it on YouTube. You can go YouTube 3000 NFL Mock Draft or whatever, on SoundCloud as well. That's it for this edition of the show. Come back next week for a brand new draft.